Welcome to Under the Lens. Come and enjoy an extraordinary, raw, and unfiltered podcast that delivers debate, discussions, and interviews about film, pop culture, and everything in between. Here is your host, film critic and journalist, Byron Lafayette.
My guest today is a retired Army lieutenant colonel who served in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot and aircraft commander, and in Iraq as an intelligence officer. He is a prolific author of over 80 books, both fiction and nonfiction, and is widely regarded as the world's foremost authority on the Roswell crash. He can be heard weekly on the nationally syndicated radio show Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie, and on his podcast, A Different Perspective. He is here today to discuss his latest book, UFOs and the Deep State. Please join me in welcoming Kevin D. Randle.
Thank you so much for joining me today on Under the Lens. I'm very excited to be talking with you. 5 years ago or so, I found a used copy of your MJ12 paper. And I found that book in my used library bookstore, and I was just glued to it. I was like, "Oh, this looks interesting. I'll start reading this." And then I couldn't put it down.
Well, I updated the book, which was cleverly called MJ12 Update, that had additional information that I'd learned since the original book was published in 2000 or that time frame, about 20 years ago. So I updated it recently and included additional information, things that I'd learned about some of the documents since then and some of the things that have been going on. And of course, talked to the Woods about it, talked to Stan Friedman about it, made some inquiries in other places. So it's got some updated information, but what you have is essentially the story saying that MJ12 is a hoax from even the original documents that Stan was promoting so much. I think they were all created by two individuals with an eye to propel themselves into the mainstream again, or keep themselves on TV.
That's really unfortunate when that kind of stuff happens. And, it kind of seems that sometimes there's people who gravitate to, movements, like the UFO research community, to try and get names for themselves or make money or something like that.
Well, Jacques Vallee just did it with his Trinity, the untold true story of nothing, I guess. A guy named Douglas Dean Johnson spent 3 months investigating the claims. I'd done it earlier when the book first came out, and I'd interviewed Jacques Vallee and that sort of thing, but the story just does not hold up. And the critical feature, what's happened is Tom Carey had interviewed one of the main guys, Remy Baca, in 2003, and the story that Baca told Tom Carey, which is audio taped, so we can compare it to what they were saying later, is completely different. There's all these things that just do not track, and it just really, I think, drives a stake through this whole story. And it's kind of surprising that Jacques Vallee would get caught up in something like that because of the body of work that he had done previously to that. And I think all of us in the UFO field have kind of followed Jacques Vallee's career and look at the research he's done and kind of the logical presence he brings to the whole UFO community. And this kind of destroys part of that legacy.
That's very unfortunate. Yeah, because I'm not like a massive. I'm not very familiar with his work, but I know the name and I know he was respected in the community. So that's very unfortunate to hear.
But I mean, the kind of contrast with the guys creating the MJ12 document for the purpose of I guess trying to drag themselves into the arena once again. Jacques Vallee didn't need to do that. And he was already there. His books are, I've used his books and read his books. So there you go. The Carey interview, one of the parts of that was Remy Baca was asking Carey, well, how can I make money on this? And so I'd send Jacques Vallee an email about a week ago, 10 days ago. And he said, are you familiar with the Carey tape? What are your comments on it? And the only thing he wrote back almost immediately and said that the fact that he was trying to make money on it was really irrelevant. And I agree with him. It really is kind of irrelevant, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was all these significant divergence from the original from the story that he was telling, that Baca and Padilla told later. As just one example, he talked about how they had ridden horses down to watch the craft crash. Well, in the version he gives to Carrie, they were driving in a pickup truck, and his cousin, who was 9 or 10, was driving the pickup truck because, and this is something I know from living in Iowa, and farmers, the kids were driving the vehicles all over the farm. They weren't licensed to drive, but they were on the private property, so there was really no problem. But they were driving a pickup truck. And now they're riding horseback. They didn't see it crash. They came upon it being if it had already crashed. And you look at that and say, well, gee, how can we get these meshed to make some kind of cogent sense if it's not him inventing the story as he goes along?
No, exactly. Oh, that's always interesting, and especially changing like aspects of the story that people are going to like notice. It's not like just changing a little detail here. It's like changing your mode of transportation is a pretty large part of the story.
The very fact that Carrie still had the tape, and I put Douglas Johnson in touch with Tom Carey, because Carey had sent me an email after I'd done something about this, and he said I had a taped interview with him, and Douglas called Carey and asked him up for the tape, and Carey said, well, I don't know. I got all these tapes, and some of them are marked and some of them aren't. I don't know where it is. But apparently Tom went and looked for it and found it. And so you can listen to the taped interview yourself on Doug Johnson's website. Just type in Doug Johnson or type in Trinity crash, and you'll get there. And the audio wave file is there for everybody to listen to, and so you can compare it to what is being said today with what he was saying basically 20 years ago.
Wow, man! With I would say your almost legendary reputation for looking at the absolute details of things, and addressing whether or not, I always like, from your books that you go at it from the perspective of almost like a skeptic, of like, oh, I'm going to disprove this so that I can find the truth, I remember when I was reading your the Roswell A to Z, I really enjoyed that perspective, of looking at it of like, okay, I'm going to look at this as if there's problems with it to find the truth that's there. What got you down the road to being, like a UFO researcher, and what got you to the point where you wanted to devote your time to this?
Well, part of the problem was I was always interested in UFOs from the time I was a little kid. And my mother kind of sparked the interest with her interest in science fiction. So I was doing that. I was a member of APRO for a long time, and did some field investigation for them. And while I was going to college, I say I went to college on my Saga scholarship. Saga was a magazine from the 1970s. And they would publish UFO stories, and they created another magazine called UFO Report. And by writing an article, basically a semester for them, I could almost pay my entire tuition.
That's amazing.
So, that kind of inspired it. But as you begin to sell things, if you aspire to be a writer, selling an article is always a great motivation to do something similar to see how well it goes. I had wanted to write science fiction, and hooked up with a guy named Bob Cornett, and we wrote some science fiction stories, some science fiction books. But that kind of got it going. Then I guess in 1988, I was invited to a science fiction convention, and Don Schmitt was going to be there. I didn't know Don Schmitt from anybody. And there was going to be a debate on UFOs, and it was going to be 3 science fiction writers. One of them was Frederick Pohl, who everybody who's in science fiction knows the name. I mean, he wrote some of the great science fiction of the golden age. I think George R.R. Martin may have been one of them before he was George R.R. Martin. And actually, I visited Martin at his home in Dubuque, Iowa at one point, which he, of course, wouldn't remember, before he became the really big name he is today. And it was going to be me on this with the science fiction writers, and it would be Don Schmitt and some guy from the Center for UFO Studies. Well, Don showed up and the other guy didn't. So it's a debate. So I said, well, I'll switch sides. So it wouldn't be 3-on-1. It would be 2-2 because it's a debate. So you're supposed to be able to debate either side. And after that was over, a few weeks after that ended, I got a call from the Center for UFO Studies, and they were going to reopen the Roswell investigation. They'd spoken to Stan, and Stan said there's a lot of stuff to be done. And Don knew my military background and thought, because a lot of the witnesses would be former military, and we'd be talking to people who were involved in the military capacity, that background might be of significant value. And I told Don at the time, I just don't think there's anything to this. It's a crashed flying saucer, for crying out loud. And after the Aztec thing came out, it was thoroughly debunked by J.P. Kahn of the San Francisco Chronicle. I think it was the Chronicle, or some newspaper. He did a big article in True Magazine in the 1950s about it. The entire UFO community was against the idea of crash flying saucers until Len Stringfield started collecting those stories. And one of the stories that he collected, one of the stories he got, not the first one, but one of the first people to talk to Jesse Marcel, which was the officer who picked up the debris, got people interested in it. And then in 1980, the Roswell incident came out, which was described by one of the authors, Bill Moore, as a disgraceful hodgepodge of fact and fiction. And he is absolutely correct on that point. But because of the investigation had kind of lapsed and Stan's attention was diverted to MJ-12, he said, yeah, there's stuff to be done. So Don said, you want to go to Roswell and take a look at this? And I said, okay. And I set up a meeting with Bill Brazel, the son of the man who found it. I did it by sending him a letter. And I said, if you'd like to talk to us, we'd like to speak with you, and give me a collect call. And I remember when he called, my wife was more excited about him calling me than I was. So we got to meet with Bill Brazel. And the trip down there, the first person we were supposed to was Frank Joyce, but he was sick and he didn't want to meet with us. And we said, okay. Then we're going to meet with a group in Albuquerque. They turned out to be a really new age group and were way off into the woo-woo stuff. That didn't help. We got down to Roswell. I was going to say San Antonio for some reason. Roswell, and met with Cliff Stone, and he doesn't want to meet us. He wants us to meet up with us at Burger King, the local Burger King. He shows up in his Army uniform, and I thought, well, this guy's a yo-yo. And I don't know why he didn't want to meet us at his house, because his address was in the telephone book. But within 30 minutes, we were at his house, and he's smoking a cigar and walking up and down and lecturing us on UFOs. And I'm thinking, yeah, I know this stuff. You don't have to tell me. So by the time we got to Bill Brazel, which was on our last day down there, and the last interview we had set up, I'm thinking, this is really a nothing story. There's nothing here. And then we sat down with Bill Brazel, and we're talking to the guy, and he's really down-to-earth guy. His uncle is the man who killed Pat Garrett, who killed Billy the Kid. So I got some of the Brazel family history out of that, which was kind of interesting.
Very interesting.
But once we sat down and we chatted with him about this, it just turned the whole trip around. And as we're going back to the airport, I said to Don, we've got to come back. There's more to learn. And so we were back within 4 to 6 weeks, and we began making multiple trips down there because we were talking to more and more people. We talked to Walter Hott. We talked to the family of the sheriff. We talked to various witnesses, the various aspects of the case. And it became not just one guy telling us a cockamamie story. If it was Jesse Marcel standing alone, you could say, well, the guy just misinterpreted it. It's nothing there. But every member of Colonel Blanchard's staff, Colonel Blanchard being the commanding officer in Roswell in 1947, every member of his senior staff that we talked to, with one exception, told us it was real. And one of the things that really turned it around for me was Edwin Easley, who was the provost marshal. It's like the top cop. He commanded both the security police and the military police. The military police were responsible for patrolling the streets of Roswell for soldiers who were getting into trouble. And the security force was responsible for the security of the base. And at one point, I finally asked him. I mean, he was very hesitant to talk. He would tell me if I asked a question went too far, he'd say, "Well, I can't talk about that. I sworn to secrecy." But I could tell that he wanted to help. And I asked him at the end of the first conversation, "Do you mind if I call you back if I have more questions?" He said, "No, call me back." So I got an opportunity to talk to him again. And I finally said to him, "Are we following the right path?" And he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, we think it was extraterrestrial." And he said, "Well, let me put it this way. It's not the wrong path," which is in essence telling we're on the right path. I mean, here's the security. Here's the a senior officer telling me it's the right path. Jesse Marcel, senior officer, telling me it's the right path. And we talked to a number of other officers who were there at the time. And then we were looking at the enlisted soldiers as well and getting the same thing. I talked to a guy, it would have been 4 or 5 years ago now. He was like 409 years old when I finally got to him. But I mean, one of the enlisted men. And he says to me, well, we're not supposed to talk about that. I mean, here's a guy who's 89 years old. There's absolutely nothing they can do to him. And he said they were warned not to talk about it. So, I mean, we got it from all kinds of people. We got all kinds of angles. We got little bits and pieces of the story. Some guys didn't see much, didn't know much. One guy we talked to handled some of the debris because he was part of the crew that boxed it up to be shipped out. And one of the sergeants had slipped a piece into his pocket and showed it to him. It was the metal that you could fold up and it would unfold itself. I mean, one little piece, the guy, that's his big story. Well, we boxed it up. The crates seemed to be very light, like there was nothing in them. But they sealed these crates up and put them in the transport planes to ship them out. So, well, you know, that kind of kept the story going for me. But the initial interest came about with talking to Bill Brazel, with talking to Don Schmitt, and learning that there was more to be told about it. Talking to Len Stringfield about what he'd learned and the people he'd interviewed. So it became an interesting story that way. Didn't mean for it to become a cottage industry with the various plots, but by the same token, after we put out the first book, and the reason we did that early was we were trying to recoup some of the money we'd spent. We spent a lot of money. We had no financial resources other than our own. I know Walt Andrus of MUFON was really annoyed. He kept asking me, where are you getting your money? And I said, out of my hip pocket. and so we did the first book, which was preliminary. Then we did another book, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell. And he said, well, why did you call it that? And I said, because I wanted to incorporate the name the UFO Crash at Roswell in the second book, because that leads you from the first book to the second. And when I submitted the publisher wasn't sure about that. And so what I did was I printed the new stuff on blue pages and the old stuff on white pages, so you can just look at the manuscript and you can see all the blue pages in it, that sort of thing. So you get an idea of how much has been added to the first book.
That's very smart.
But it just kept going from there. We were learning more things, and leads would come in, and people would call with stories, and we'd have to check them out. And some of them were cockamamie. A guy named Trowbridge, I think it was, said that he was the last living guy to handle the debris. He passed away a couple of years ago. And he said that he was at the Marcel house playing bridge the night that Jesse Marcel brought the stuff back. And I'm thinking, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. Why would they be having a bridge party when Jesse Marcel isn't there?
Yeah.
And if he's got this material, why does he bring it in and show it to everybody? And why does Jesse Jr. not talk about this other guy being there? So you just kind of throw that stuff out. Trowbridge was useless. I talked to a guy named Sprouse, I think it was, whose crew was involved in some of the transporting of the material, but he wasn't there at the time. He had been on TDY or on leave or something, and he came back and his friends were telling him about it. And the same thing, one of the MPs I talked to, he wasn't on the detail to guard the crash site, but he said that he remembered when his friends came back, they were talking about what they had seen in the barracks, and he didn't believe them until the next day when he read it in the newspaper. So that kind of narrowed down when it happened, when they were involved, because we've got the newspaper, and while he wasn't directly involved, he added a little bit of interest to the story, because here's a guy who was there with the MPs. We know he's with the MPs. His picture's in the yearbook. And that's the other thing. I got an email from a guy not long ago, and I can't remember the name. It started with a D. I can't remember the guy's name. He says, was this guy involved? He said, he may have been an officer. I don't know. And so I looked him up in the yearbook, and he wasn't there. And I looked him up in the telephone directory. We had a little base telephone directory. There he was, bigger than snot. He was a major. And so I'm remembering now the movie, All the President's Men, where they were trying to work where by the phone numbers. So I saw his phone number. I said, well, I'll see who has got a phone number close to that. He was in the office with Jesse Marcel. His base phone number was the same as Jesse Marcel's. Here's a guy who had an important could have told us something important. Nobody had ever heard his name.
Oh, wow.
And he, had passed away, and a friend, he said, well, I used to talk to him about UFOs, and he kind of hinted he was at Roswell. Could that be true? And it turned out, yeah, he was a major, and he was in the office of Marcel. Nobody thought about that.
Oh, that's so sad.
Absolutely. 20 years ago, if I'd gotten the guy's name, I'd have said, oh my God, we got to talk to this guy. He's in the office with Marcel. We know it. He's got the same phone number.
Oh,
you got to pull all those tricks out. But we had a yearbook that Walter Hott made for 1947. It's apparently the only year they did. They started it in May, and it finished it up in August, and had it to the printer, and got it back in November of 1947. So here's a list of like 1,500 people who were at the base at the time. Not everybody knew it, but we went down through any number of people, and we talked to many, many people who knew nothing about it because they wouldn't have been involved. Mm-hmm. But we had that resource. We had the base telephone directory. We had the city directory. So we could look all these sorts of things up to verify. So some guy says, well, I was in Roswell in 1947. Well, can you explain why you're not in the yearbook? But a lot of guys, but the other side of that coin is, I remember 4 or 5 people who were not in the yearbook who turned out to be in the base telephone directory. So they were clearly there in 1947. One of the guys, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go on. Pappy Henderson doesn't have a picture in the yearbook, but he's with his crew in one of the back pictures. So it's not one of the individual pictures like you'd see in a yearbook, but he's with his crew. So he was obviously there in 1947.
For our listeners, when you refer to the yearbook, what are you referring to when you say that? Is that the base registry?
No, it's just a yearbook they put together, like a high school yearbook. It was just everybody assigned to the base, and one of Walter Hott's tasks was to create a yearbook. So they arranged for the base photographer to pictures of everybody, and they got pictures of the flight crews together. They got pictures of things going on. So it was a yearbook. Now, the interesting thing is George Eberhardt, I numbered the pages, and I took out the pages that were of no interest to me, that just really didn't have anything important on them. And then I numbered the pages. So George Eberhardt made an index from that copy. It's only good for my copy because the page numbers won't track otherwise. But I remember one of the guys named Porter said something to Stan Friedman about it. He said, where did you get the index? And he said, well, I had it made. No, you didn't, Stan. I had it made. George Eberhardt made it for us. And the page numbers only work if you've got a copy of the yearbook I have, because I numbered the pages. So if you go through the regular yearbook and you number the pages, you're not going to find it. You can get close to the guy, but you're not going to get the guy, because there were pages they just were not of any interest to me. They just didn't have any pictures of people on them, and it was really for the people that we wanted. And we get to the air crews, we want the pictures because there's guys' names attached to that. So there you go.
Man, it's just fascinating having to play like needle in a haystack of, finding out who's involved, who's not, who has information, who could possibly have information. And then, as you said, some people had information that nobody knew had information.
And remember, we were doing this in 1990 before the internet exploded. I had a telephone directory for the United States that was on CD-ROMs. Somebody had put a lot of phone books from various places in the United States on it, so we could use that. Don was able to get information because of where he worked, and so we could find some of that down. But then we're having to call the people, and it's costing us money because there's long distance charges. Not like today where you can call Canada for free, for crying out loud. You call the United States for free on your cell phone. And we didn't have the cell phones. We didn't have the internet resources we do today. Some of the stuff that we really worked hard to find out appears on the internet now. You just type in the right question and it just pops up for you. I don't know. I think that's a very useful tool.
This is very true, because I can imagine how difficult it would have been having to find all that information, because, I remember, I went to college, back, internet was still around, obviously, but even that, so much research was done in books, it's, in law libraries, stuff like that. And so I can only imagine even years before, when there wasn't the internet the way it is now, I can't even imagine how difficult that would be and time consuming.
Well, there's a lot of resources. We'd have to look at telephone directories. If we knew where some guy lived, if we had an idea where the city it was, we could go to the telephone directory. There'd probably be a telephone number there.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we would call somebody and say, well, you need to talk to so-and-so. Well, do you have the phone number? Sure, call them at this, so you could call them. I got Bill Brazel's phone number, and I couldn't believe I did it. I called Director Assistance in New Mexico, which I guess doesn't exist anymore. New Mexico exists, not Directory Assistance. And I said, I'd like to talk to Bill Brazel, and she gave me the number. I mean, didn't really, and you try to call New York City at that time, and you could tell them the address and everything, and it's big one of the skyscrapers. Well, I can't help you.
Uh-huh.
I'm talking to this woman in New Mexico, and she's got the name for me. You got the number for me.
Oh, man, that's really
one of the guys I was looking for, as a matter of fact, I called Directory Assistance. I said, if I give you the prefix,
mm-hmm.
I think it was 505. No, 505 at the time, 515. If I give you the prefix for the phone number, the first 3 digits of the 7-digit phone number, can you tell me what city it is? And she said yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I gave it to her, and she told me the city. And then I had a copy of the phone book, a phone book from that little city, and I looked the guy's name up. I found it.
Mm-hmm.
So we were going through all that rigmarole just to learn a little bit about, just to find out that the guy we were researching wasn't probably the greatest source in the world.
That's what happens in research. It's like sometimes you go down, what you think is the path, and it turns out to be a rabbit trail. But it's what you have to do. Mm-hmm.
Well, we say, I think at one point we were saying we talked to 500 witnesses, and people would say, well, you did not, and we.
Mm-hmm.
And indirectly, that's true. We talked to 500 people, but some of them hadn't witnessed anything.
Mm-hmm.
We had to follow up on it, and we would get to some people that wouldn't talk to you. I talked to a guy named Crookshank,
mm-hmm.
who is a retired 4-star general. At one point, he was in charge of ATIC, Air Technical Intelligence. Well, he was the director of the Foreign Technology Division. And I called him up, and he said to me, "I don't know who you are. I don't know what's classified and what's not classified, and I'm not going to talk to you." The discussion. But I happened to be in Dayton, Ohio, where he still lived. I was meeting with General Exxon, because Exxon was going to be at the golf tournament at the base. So I went to meet him at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And that was kind of cool, because at the Oak Officers Club, there were 3 slots for general officers. He says, "Take one of those." And I go, "Yeah, I get to drive you. You get to park in the general slot."
Oh. Thank you for joining me for part 1 of this in-depth discussion on Kevin Randle's book, UFOs and the Deep State. Please be sure to check out part 2 for the conclusion of our discussion.